Hi everyone, good afternoon and thank you for joining us today for our fifth webinar of 2022. All of our webinars are specifically designed to assist you, support coordinators, with knowledge of the NDIS, but also to provide the best possible outcome for your clients. I'm Richard Socrates from Blue Chip and I'll be your host again today. I can see a few people still entering, so I'll take this opportunity to say the acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands we meet on today and their continued connection to land, water and culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. And hi to Alan. All right. Our topic for today is supported independent living, aka SIL. We're going to explain SIL at an introduction pace, I guess, a foundational level. This is part one of a two-part series with the second part scheduled for the 15th of September, where we will be diving into how to identify eligibility for clients and also the application process for SIL. As you have registered for this webinar, you will automatically be registered for part two. This webinar will run for around about 45 minutes to an hour, just depending on how many questions we have. If you have missed, as I said, this is our fifth webinar this year. If you have missed the previous webinars, there they are. You can watch them on YouTube, our YouTube channel. Just search for Blue Chip Blue CHP, as in Community Housing Provider, or click on that link that Jess just sent you, and you can save it somewhere and watch those whenever you would like. All right, speaking of Jess, Jess Ford, our marketing manager, she's behind the scenes again today. There she is. She'll be keeping things running and keeping us on time. If you do have any technical issues, please just reach out in the chat function to Jess. You can do that privately or publicly. Better if you do it privately to Jess, but she'll get back to you. Now, your screen should look like this with the chat function on the right. If you can't see that white section of chat, just click on those chat bubbles and it will open up the chat function. Likewise, if you have any questions during the presentation, type them in the chat there. We will get, if we can't get to the question straight away, we will definitely get to it in the dedicated Q&A at the end of the presentation. Finally, this recording, we are recording this presentation and we'll be sending you this and any materials that we share in the webinar to the email that you registered when you registered for this webinar. All right, I think that covers us for housekeeping. So today we're teaming up with Life Without Barriers, also known as LWB, to present this webinar. LWB, just a little bit of info on them, if you don't already know, one of the largest SIL providers in Australia. It's great that they can join us today and share their knowledge on the SIL topic. Thank you to the entire LWB team for partnering with us today. If you don't know who they are a national provider of services in foster care, aged care and disability. By 2025, LWB want to be known for their great service, influencing systemic barriers and making impact for future generations. As I said, it's great to have them on board. Blue Chip, we're a Tier 1 community housing provider, not-for-profit and registered SDA provider. Our Guide You Home initiative helps people through our client-led 7-step process to build an SDA home to their needs. My advice to any of you, if you have any clients in your caseloads that are eligible or you think may be eligible for SDA, it's never too early to have a chat with us. All right. Our speakers for today from LWB, we've got Jonathan Hodgson and Rebecca Yench. Joining Jonathan and Rebecca is Blue Chip's own Chloe Day. Please welcome our presenters. Okay, so what we're going to cover today. First up, we'll take a look at the origins of SIL, what it is, what it isn't, where to find SIL in a participant's NDIS plan. We'll look at the intensity levels and what that means. SIL is not housing, or is it? And we'll have a look at that, and also SIL vacancies. pros and cons for different types of housing, who pays for what, and finally the things to consider as a support coordinator. It does sound all very confusing to me, so let's try and make some sense of it. And I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to get us underway.
So, hi everyone, I'm Jonathan. I'm the State Program Manager for Support Coordination, LWB. Obviously, we're talking about SIL, so I think a good place to start is where did SIL come from? SIL is a product of the transition to the NDIS. The NDIS, as I'm sure you're aware, was and continues to be a major reform to disability supports in Australia. It's the first time a national approach to disability supports has been taken, and continue to. And with the inception of the NDIS and the categorising of supports in the home, SIL was the most closely linked support to the block funded model, which was historically the way in which providers were allocated funding to support people with disabilities. It really didn't have a fit for purpose model. It was not designed for choice and control, nor was it set up to really facilitate the capacity building that we do see with the NDIS. When it came to delivering, with the inception of the NDIS and the categorising supports in the home, SIL was the category that most closely aligned with that block funding model. When it came to practically delivering SIL, providers fell into incorporating a lot of the same processes that they had in these SIL models. This was partly to do with the lack of understanding of what the transition to the NDIS meant, both for them as a provider and, most importantly, for the participants they support. This is an area that had a lot of evolution over time and has now shifted from strictly a service model for people sharing 24/7 support in a group environment to a tool focusing on how support in that environment is reimbursed. These changes are aligning to SIL being a more consumer-led model that it was designed to be, separating it from that block funding model that we just spoke about. Historically, SIL has also been a bit of a catch-all. It's a common experience for providers to feel that SIL has been used to fill gaps from reduced funding in other areas or to make up in shortfalls in funding. You can commonly see where reduced capacity building and community participation budgets were met with perceived expectations of SIL providers picking up the slack. There's always been a lot of talk historically around the cost of SIL and its sustainability. Some people, including the NDIS themselves, have gone as far as saying that the cost could jeopardise the future of the whole scheme. With that in mind, I think it's probably pretty important to talk about some of the numbers about people receiving SIL in the NDIS. So this data is the most up to date that we could get. So the current number of participants receiving SIL is 26,615. That's 5.7% of all participants on the scheme. The average plan, including SIL, $349,000 per year, compared to an average plan of participants without SIL, $39,500. So there's obviously a significant change or a significant increase in funding there. And so far, this is 6.9 billion of 15.1 billion made in core payments. It's for SIL. It's obviously a significant amount of money. It's important to remember that when a plan has SIL in there, it also has lots of other supports. And this is normally due to the participant requiring generally higher support, requiring more supports, and the intensity of supports being higher. Participants receiving SIL almost always supported 24/7, hence the significantly increased cost compared to a plan without SIL in there. The cost of SIL supports have grown over time, growing about 17% per annum, These are all figures that we've pulled from the Summer Foundation's policy position statement, and a link to this report will pop up on the screen at some point. When discussing these figures, I do want to point out that 5.7% of participants on the receiving SIL is very close to the projected 6% of participants that are expected to qualify for SDA. And when reporting these figures of $349,000 per year of an average plan cost, it's been challenging to drill down into the data and see how much of that is actually SIL and what is other costs. It means, for example, a participant that may be receiving SDA and SIL would unfairly be inflating the cost. It's also important to note that although the costs are significant, the proportion of participants with SIL as a proportion of all participants on the scheme continues to decrease over time as more participants join the NDIS. The interesting part of this is the demographics of people that are joining the NDIS. More and more younger people joining the scheme, and therefore less people in SIL as a percentage of the overall number. However, on the flip side, 18 to 24-year-olds receiving SIL in their NDIS plans have a budget of $437,000, which is on average $88,000 more than the scheme average. Overall, the percentage of participants on the scheme that are funded for SIL is decreasing and has reduced from 7.3% in June 2018 to 5.7% in June 2021. So what is SIL? The NDIS definition of what SIL is, and this is quoted as supported independent living, SIL, is a shared living experience for people with a disability who have SIL funding in their NDIS plan. Interesting way of describing, well, in my opinion, it's an interesting way of describing SIL supports. The key takeaway for me is the word shared and what that means for different people across the scheme. For some people, sharing supports in a house, supports and I guess the property itself will be exactly what they want and what they need to build their capacity to live life. However, for others, and I'm sure a lot of you have probably already heard of or worked with participants in this position, the sharing support and or residence is not what they need for a countless number of reasons. The way the NDIS describes SIL is unusual, in my opinion. I think it would be more important. I think the more important side is what the daily application actually looks like for people who have the funding in their plan. In its application, SIL supports provided in the home, or it's support provided in the home to assist a participant with their daily life and activities. Through SIL, you have access to trained staff who will support you for up to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Some examples of supports a participant in SIL could receive are help to manage money and household budgeting, assistance with cooking, meal preparation, assistance with cleaning, laundry, gardening, medication management, assistance with personal care, assistance with help to catch public transport to access the community. So what a huge range of supports, and a good SIL provider will work with the participant to ensure they've got exactly the supports they're required to reach their daily goals. An important part of SIL to discuss is also the ratios of which some SIL supports are provided. Supports in SIL are delivered and funded at different ratios, dependent on participants' needs throughout their day and week. This has been recently outlined in a document called the Roster of Care, and that breaks down a participant's week into small blocks, half-an-hour blocks, and outlines the support ratios that are needed for those different parts of the day. Despite the funding being outlined in this way, it's really important that the participant does have the flexibility to move those supports around. And it's important for us as support coordinators to remember that those supports are flexible, and you should be working with participants to make sure they're getting the right support at the right time of the day. An example, I've recently worked with a participant who was able to work, and their shift in the morning changed, So we work with the SIL provider to change their one-on-one support in the morning to a different time, so they could still access, still go to work and be on time for that. It's obviously hugely important for their capacity building. We need to make sure that they are getting the support that's tailored to them. I guess I've kind of also been talking a lot about what SIL is. I think it's equally important to talk about what SIL isn't. Quite often people understand what it is, but sometimes there's a lot of confusion and grey areas around what it doesn't cover. So SIL funding does not cover day-to-day living expenses. Items covered under other NDIS budgets, such as transport, or other supplies that aren't related to your disability. For example, SIL funding will not cover the cost of rent, buying a home, mortgage repayments, electricity, phone, gas, internet bills, food and groceries, cleaning and gardening supplies, assistive technology, home repairs, and other day-to-day living expenses. We will cover more about this later in the conversation, but it's important to remember that SIL is the support that is provided, and it's not the place that the support takes place. So where's SIL funding found in the plan? SIL it's a core support. It's outlined in the plan through the assistance with daily living category. SIL funding is usually broken down into two parts. These are the regular SIL funding, and this is the amount that's been determined by the NDIS Home and Living team to be suitable to support the participant in the SIL environment. The team will take into account the roster of care that's been submitted, or the reports from allied health professionals, and just any other supporting evidence. The second part of the SIL funding is the irregular SIL funding. This funding is for participants who require support outside of their usual SIL support. For example, they're unwell and they can't attend their day service. This funding allows the provider to support the participant at home and claim for the time that they are providing the support. The two amounts will be displayed in the plan, usually in the core section. The larger number will always be the SIL funding, and the smaller number the irregular. There are, however, some situations where irregular funding isn't provided in plans. An example of this would be if someone's supported one-on-one 24/7, and that this is an exception. The NDIS would be expecting that because the one-on-one funding's there all the time, the support coordinators would be working between the budgets to move funding around to cover that support. And that's an area that you are quite likely to stay involved with as a support coordinator.
I think it's also still important to highlight that even if someone isn't funded for irregular support, as a service provider and as a support coordinator, you also do have an argument to try and get that level of funding on the basis that things are going to happen, things are going to come up, and unless that individual has some flexible core in their funding, you're actually, as a SIL provider, going to be short on your funding if you don't have any irregular supports, even with that one-on-one 24/7 funding. So it is really important to even try and justify a small portion of irregular supports, because you're only actually using that in an emergency if needed to, but it's good to be able to have that sitting there in case.
Have you got any tips on how to go about that, Chloe?
It's never easy. It's always going to be a fight at the NDIA, but I think the thing is being able to evidence it. So if you look at a lot of participants that have that one-to-one funding model need, we're looking at people that have high complex needs all the time. So that may be physical supports, that may be behavioural support. So you're going to have times where, especially if you're looking at that behavioural support side, where you're potentially going to have maybe a second staff member coming in because an incident's happened, those sorts of things. And unless you have some flexible core, you're not going to be able to fund that. But by gathering and tracking some of that data and getting support from the OTs, if there's behaviour support, anyone actually that's involved in that stakeholder group can help you try and justify that small level of funding. It is still really hard to get. They will push back on it every time. as their right to do so, but you can get it across the line, especially if you've got someone with high complex needs that maybe have that even 2 staff at all times and requires extra support due to incidents. So it's all about, I guess, gathering that data, keeping track of it all and presenting it to try and get that level of funding. But I would always recommend, even if it's one-to-one, you always still ask for a regular support. You never just go, we won't get it. You always try and get it.
Awesome. Thank you. I guess that kind of leads quite nicely into this intensity levels for funding. So at this stage, we're quite often hear still providers talking about intensity levels, funding participants' plans, and normally it's because the plan's seen a reduction in funding, and that's because of the drop from or changes in intensity levels. And still funding is currently funded at 2 different levels of intensity. And this is decided by the complexity of the participants' support needs. And the current levels of intensity are, as on the screen, the standard, where a participant requires 24-hour active assistance with most daily tasks, and higher, where the participant requires continual and more complex active assistance. Historically, there was a 3rd support intensity. This was removed in July 2020. And there's lower intensity, and that was described as where the participant requires regular supervision of living arrangements. I believe this drop in intensity levels that providers are experiencing stems from providers still having some of that block funding model mindset, and not they appear that they seem to think the funding will remain. Once it's there, it's going to stay there indefinitely, and that's not the case. It's important that providers do provide supporting evidence for these funding levels. I think, Chloe, you can probably talk a bit more to that as well.
Yeah, so obviously, once again, evidence is the biggest thing when wanting to get that right level of funding. It's quite hard to get that higher intensity funding for SIL without being able to justify that staff are having to intervene with either a medical condition or a behaviour numerous times a day, numerous times a shift. The best thing to do is, once again, gather that evidence. But if you've got, behaviour support involved, behaviour recording sheets are a great piece of evidence. If you don't have that level of funding already and you're trying to justify that level of funding as well, it's as simple as an Excel tracking sheet to track how many phone calls you may have to respond to a day, because it's not just necessarily the in-home supports that you're looking at that high intensity. It's also, I guess, the case management side of that as well. How much involvement needs to be by the SIL provider in general. So tracking down phone calls, how many a day, the frequency of those, escalations, how many times your staff have to respond to certain situations. The more evidence that you can provide, the higher chance you have of actually getting that higher intensity. But as I said, it is quite difficult to get at the moment. You're most likely going to get standard without having that really high level of evidence and being able to speak to that in a planning meeting.
And is there sort of timeframes that support coordinators should be working with providers? Well, and I guess it's obviously the responsibility is on the provider to be doing the data tracking and collection, but is there timeframes that we should be saying you need a year's worth of data, or 6 months? Like what works? Is there a
I think the more that you can provide them, the better it is. But you would want at least, 6 months worth of consistent tracking of data to be able to say, over the 6 months, this is the picture of what it looks like. These are all the things that we've tried to reduce us having to ask for this high intensity of supports, but none of that is working, which is why we're requesting this level of support, because it means we can continue providing the level that's required for this participant. They're always going to obviously want to give you the standard intensity rate, but if you can justify the amount of work that actually goes into supporting this participant in a SIL environment, and that it is only sustainable with that higher level of funding, that's the point you need to be able to get across. And by providing, that 6 months worth of consistent data where you're able to show every single day that this is happening, that's your best option to do
absolutely. That. I think I've had a bit of experience where we've got the data, but then it's you need to make sure you're using the strategies provided by the behaviour support practitioner. So it is quite a complicated process, but it's something that is really important. Certainly, in my opinion, it is, because if a participant needs the higher support need, then obviously we need to work to do everything that we can to get it to them.
And it is also a really time-consuming process for the support coordinator, the service provider. But without that, you're never going to get the level of funding you actually need. So it is worth putting in that extra time, even though you're not necessarily funded for it in that beginning process, in the hope that you're going to get the required funding that you need for that long-term support model.
Thank you, Chloe. So sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, and I guess it is one of the key takeaways from the webinar is that SIL is not housing. SIL is the support that is provided or delivered to the participant in their residence. The NDIS does fund the physical home in different situations. So as up here on the screen, SDA, MTA and STA. But in SIL, it's not funded through the participant's PAN, the actual bricks and mortar. It's the support that happens in the home. It's something important to remember, and sometimes there is confusion around that. I'm going to hand over to Beck because I've been rabbiting on for a while. So Beck's going to talk for the next few slides.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Olbeck, the New South Wales Senior Support Coordinator at Life Without Barriers. So I'm going to talk to today the search for SIL vacancies and some of the things support coordinators should know when you're looking at SIL homes or vacancies for your participants. You're likely to be familiar with services like GoNest or the Housing Hub, but for regional areas or more remote areas, homes are often sought through contacting your local SIL providers that operate in the area and asking them what capacity they might have to provide the support to your participant. There are different ways housing is owned or tenanted, and that has an effect on your participant. The ideal world, this is something that should be considered, whether it's community housing, a private rental with a participant having SIL supports or a SIL owned and operated home. You will be prioritising what is more important and working from there. Support provider location, appropriateness of the property, how it's owned and provided are all going to be important things that you need to look at for your participant. I'm just to talk some of the pros and cons of SIL support. Pros and cons of housing options that SIL can be provided in is a different type of accommodation. In SDA accommodation, SIL supports being provided by the same provider can be beneficial for secure support arrangements, and modifications will generally be more accessible. So having home mods done will definitely be quicker. However, being locked into that provider at that location takes away the choice and control from your participant. SIL provider owned creates a simple model, but again, locked into that provider in that location. Whereas with a private rental, either by a community housing avenue or a private rental market, creates choice and control around provider. Although the risk that in the current property market, rental properties are not generally long-term options for people on the scheme. Your own family-owned property, this is your house, so it's your choice. So that generally is a better option. Short-term accommodation or medium-term accommodation, SIL is a rare case here, generally, but mainly used as part of a transitional process. Participant might just be out of hospital, in between accommodation, or even looking or waiting for a home modification to be completed. It's always best to evaluate the choice of housing and how these circumstances are going to affect your participant. Sorry, it's just skipped forward one on me. Who pays for what? The participant contributions, things like rent, board and lodging, like Jono mentioned earlier, are funded through the participant via their income, which could be a disability support pension, maybe even other government supports like rental assistance can aid with the costs. This is something a great SIL provider will be looking at with a participant and their supports. Essentially, the SIL is a support, not the bricks and mortar. So we talked to there just around who pays for what. So generally, the actual house itself is paid for by the participant and their funding, is paid is what is funding the SIL for them. Back to you, Jono.
Sorry, I lost my mouse. I couldn't unmute myself. So things to consider as a support coordinator, a bit of a recap of what we've been through so far and what to expect in the next part of the webinar. So this one's been a lot of theory on the background, who pays for what. The next one's going to be the practical application and tips and tricks on how to make it work best for your participants. Things to take away from this webinar. So SIL is the support and not the housing. And with that in mind, there are many different ways in which a property can be owned and or tenanted. Keep that in mind. And I know sometimes that won't be at the forefront of people's mind when searching for SIL, but if in an ideal world, we do need to consider that. There's an overlap between individuals requiring SIL and SDA, but not all individuals with SIL supports funding their plan will be eligible for SDA. It's essential that you hold providers accountable for the supports they are funded to provide and the participants that you support. Work with your participants and their providers to ensure that the supports are fit for purpose. If they need changing, make sure you work with all parties involved to facilitate this. Just a little change can make a huge difference in someone's life. Often, SIL supports are delivered in a shared environment. Make sure participants are well matched and do everything you can to make sure there's as much understanding between all residents of what each person needs to make sure it's a positive environment for people to be a part of. And that is a negotiation between the participants and the provider to make sure it works as well as possible. It's always important to have a good network, know the providers in your area, know the good OTs, know the good behaviour support practitioners, make sure people are linked in with the best services, and good knowledge of the process. And that's what next time we're going to be talking about. So it's going to be about eligibility, application of the theory, and any tips and tricks that we can think of to streamline the process and to get the best outcomes for your participants. I guess now is probably a good time to open up to any questions, unless anyone's got anything else they want to add.
Is SIL really that easy that we did it in 32 minutes at a basic level? All right, we are getting just a couple of questions there. Sorry, Chloe, you go.
I was about to say, I don't think SIL's that easy, but the theory behind it is it's the practical application of it that's the very interesting process.
Yeah, and look, that's what we will cover on the 15th of September. So as I said before, everyone that's registered for this webinar is automatically registered for the next. You will get copies of the recording of this. As you can see, Jess is sending that out. Is communicating that. So sometime later today, you'll receive the recording. And it looks like we're also going to put these slides in that as well. Couple of questions. Let's just have a look at that. It probably is more on the next webinar side, but we do have time. How do you save time with the endless referral forms? I guess, Beck, we're probably looking at you here. Most providers will not move further without the referral forms or EOI being completed. Anyone got a good response for that? Beck, you're on mute. Had to be one.
Definitely do take a lot of our time as a support coordinator completing referral forms and EOIs. However, obviously they're a pivotal part to ensure that matching process is right to the participants that may already be living in a SIL home. So I definitely understand that they're time consuming. However, it's definitely a pivotal part. I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's any particular way in relining the form filling, unfortunately. It's I guess with good relationships with the providers, you might be able to fast track things, or there might be ways that you can get the ball rolling while you're still completing those forms. But I don't think there's there's no speedy tricks or tips to speed up the actual filling in of forms.
No, I agree. I don't think there's any quick way to do it, but I think it's a positive that service providers are asking for so much information because they want to make sure that they're doing the right participant matching and they're getting the right information to make sure that they're the right service provider. So I know it's a pain when service providers are asking for a heap of information and a lot of documents I know that they will ask for, but it's actually a positive thing to make sure that they're going to be able to provide the right level of support that's being required.
All right, I'll move on to the next one. I think I might be able to answer this. To do SIL applications, is it under level 3 or level 2 support coordination or COS? That would be either, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Are participants able to get one-to-one SIL, i.e. where there are no shared supports?
Definitely, you can get one-to-one SIL support. We probably see a little bit more of that at times, but it's really going to come down to the evidence that you've got, the SIL application and the OT report. So you will have to fight for that one-to-one SIL funding, but it is possible to get that. You just need to have the right supporting documentation and evidence.
Anything else, anyone? Moving on?
No, I think you're right there. It is more difficult to get as a general thing, but there are certain circumstances where it's obviously essential that that's the funding that's there. So make sure you know the good OTs, make sure you know what reports people need, spend time on the applications, and the funding is there if you've got the evidence.
Cool. George talks about that SIL may not be suitable. He's extremely interested in workings of SDA. I would say reach out to us, George. Happy to let you know all about SDA, but also watch our webinar number 1 and webinar number 2. So webinar number 1 was all about SDA, and then 2 was about the practical application, eligibility, how to get it, and so on. So happy to help anything there, George, if you'd like to reach out to us. Joanne says, are SDA and SIL still able to be provided by the same provider? Well, I'll have a crack and anyone else can chime in. Yes, they can. There is, I guess, a focus on separation of services, but whilst it hasn't been mandated, every provider wants to ensure that there is choice and control for the participant in selecting their SDA provider, the home they live in, and their SIL provider, the supports they receive in that home. So from a blue chip perspective, whilst we partner with SIL providers like LWB, we will never say you must use that SIL provider if you want to live in that home. As I said, we start with a client before we build them a home. So they will look at their own support, bring their own supports to that home. Anyone else? Anyone else got anything on that?
I think obviously what you're saying is right, Richard. And there's obviously upsides and downsides to having the same provider and different providers. Obviously, the relationship's good, then it mightn't be the worst thing. But the separation of supports, as long as the level of support is what the participant needs, I think that's probably a better way to go.
All right. Nothing else further on that. Jaden, this may be a question for the next webinar. I'm getting conflicting news regarding the ROC, the roster of care. Is it still required with the application? I would presume so for the first application. What is the story with the ROC? Has it changed? Was it going to change?
It's in the process of changing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, guys. I think we're still getting conflicting information from the NDIA whether they want a roster of care or if they don't. My recommendation would be to always have one submitted anyway to help evidence the support that's needed. You will have some planners acknowledge it, and you will have some that will say, we've determined the level of funding, the SIL provider needs to make it work within this figure. So I would still provide one, especially in those beginning stages, but there's nothing, I guess, set in concrete at the moment around the roster of care being provided or not provided. Do you guys want to add anything to that? Because I know we've all been getting conflicting information.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think as a document, it does outline, it's quite an easy, it's a very visible way of seeing people's support needs as they change through the day. And I think it does. It's easy I find it easier to read myself to sort of figure out what people are requiring. And it's also a way that you can work with participants and families to display what the funding looks like as a whole, rather than just seeing a big dollar figure. But whether it's required, quite often, I'd say I'd stick with you on that, Chloe. Initially, absolutely, but it appears that unless there's significant change in people's support needs, the agency aren't requiring them every year like they used to.
Correct. I think we're seeing more and more that if someone's already residing in a CIL property, that they're tending just to roll the same amount of funding over unless there's been a significant change. But I would highly recommend, if there has been even a slight change, resubmitting a roster of care, and especially for that first application, having a roster of care so you can justify what the support needs are.
All right, moving along. Can I bring my own care team into a CIL? Does that mean like a CIL house? Is that what we mean by that? I'm not sure. Does that make sense to you guys? Or do you need more info?
So I think it depends that depends whether you're a one-to-one CIL or you're going into shared accommodation. If you're going into shared accommodation and there's already a CIL provider there, you can obviously bring in somebody else for CAS, but it would be very unlikely that there would be multiple CIL providers in one house for a shared accommodation model.
Okay. All right. They're very just the person goes by the name H. There you go. Has a paraplegic participant who was told he needs to go to a nursing home if he needs 24-hour care. He was declined enough hours at home. I'm not sure if that's a question or any thoughts.
I think that's about going back for a review and reviewing the OT report that would have been also submitted and making sure that it really highlights the level of support that's needed and how living in a CIL environment would be a better outcome than a nursing home. Really emphasise on the age there. I'm not sure on the age of your participant, but really emphasise the quality of life that your participant would not have if they were forced to reside in a nursing home. We're seeing a lot of work now around trying to exit people from nursing homes, 40 years. So definitely don't want to be in a nursing home. So I think, having that really good OT report to specify the quality of life that your participant would have, but I would be going back for a review. There's no reason why someone that would need that 24/7 care should be forced into a nursing home. And it's common sense that care is needed, but unfortunately, unless it's really spelled out in a report and it's written there in black and white, it's really open to interpretation. So it's back to that evidence and getting that really strong OT report.
Yeah.
And that functional assessment, getting all those assessments is key to getting the right funding.
Yeah. Evidence, and it has to be good evidence. That means a lot of things, which I guess we'll talk about in the next webinar. George just confirmed, yes, in a shared accommodation in relation to can you bring your own care team into CIL? Nothing else needs to be commented on that. That's what we thought. Thanks for clarifying, George. Sue asked about CIL funding or provider. Do they need to be registered? Yes, CIL providers need to be registered, agency registered, right? As opposed to anyone else offering support services under CORE. They may, depending on what they're providing, don't need to be registered. That's all the questions we have. Thank you to everyone that did ask a question, and thank you, panel. As I said before, part 2 coming up on the 15th. Tell your friends and please register if you think they'd be interested in how to identify eligibility, go through the application process, and then even the application of that once you've got an outcome. Thank you to everyone presenting today, Rebecca, Jonathan, Chloe. Thank you to Jess in the background. 45 minutes in, so we did really well. Thanks all, and see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.